Political fallout from the latest nuclear test by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea continues. What are the major implications? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Last Friday, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea announced it had conducted a nuclear warhead test. This was the country's fifth nuclear test and most powerful so far. The DPRK has also tested a series of ballistic missiles, including two in August, one launched from a submarine and the other that Pyongyang says could hit the United States. China expressed its opposition to the latest nuclear test. The UN and other countries like Russia and the United States denounced it too. But over the weekend, the DPRK said it will continue to develop its nuclear capability despite global condemnation and the threat of more sanctions from the international community. For more on China's reaction, we begin with CCTV correspondent Han Peng, who joins us from Beijing. And Peng, what's the latest on China's reaction to the DPRK's nuclear missile test last Friday?
And then China remains firmly opposed to DPRK's nuclear test, and it blames the United States as the crux or the origin of that problem. That comes after the U.S. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter said last week that China bears major responsibility for the DPRK's latest nuclear test. Carter's statement has been refuted by China. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying says Carter has been over-modest on his role in what she calls continued nuclear intimidation to the DPRK. She says that the nature of DPRK's nuclear issue is the conflict between Washington and Pyongyang, and urges Washington to find practical and effective solutions to that problem. Anand.
So what does China believe would be the best way forward for dealing with this issue?
Well, if you remember, China and the United States reached a landmark agreement last year on adopting tough sanctions, UN sanctions on DPRK to curb its nuclear test. And China remains committed to implementing those sanctions. But Chinese Foreign Ministry also said on Monday that only relying on sanctions cannot resolve the problem. Now the DPRK is responding to the sanctions with more nuclear tests, and if the international community responds to that by nothing but tightening the sanctions even more, China says the peninsula's nuclear issue will come to a dead end. That's why Beijing continues to call for restraint of all parties in case not to further escalate the tensions, and urges once again the resumption of six-party talks. Back to you, Anand.
Thanks, Peng. That's CCTV's Han Peng reporting from Beijing. And for more now, I'm joined by Tong Jia from Beijing. He is an associate with the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Also with us from Denver is Christopher Hill. He is a former U.S. ambassador and headed the U.S. delegation to the six-party talks on the DPRK nuclear issue. And with me here in the studio is Yoonjung Lim. She is a lecturer on Korean Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Welcome to all of you. So we have the DPRK, which has conducted its fifth nuclear test. There are reports that it's preparing for a sixth test, and the United States, in the latest bit of news that we are getting, says that it's flying a bomber over the Korean peninsula. Tong Zhao, how concerned is China over these developments, and how is this news being received in Beijing?
I think China is very much concerned about North Korea's nuclear test, because that is completely contradictory to China's principle of nuclear non-proliferation. And in addition, North Korean nuclear tests will further encourage South Korea and Japan to think more seriously about themselves going nuclear, which is contrary to Chinese security interests. And also, with North Korea's nuclear capability growing, South Korea and Japan, together with the United States, will deploy more missile defenses and other strategic military assets on the peninsula, which also undermines Chinese security interests.
Ambassador Hill, do you share that view that these tests by the DPRK could lead to nuclear proliferation on the Korean peninsula or in the region as a whole? As Tong Jia points out, that South Korea or the Republic of Korea might want its own nuclear weapons, so would Japan.
Well, I think it's been very strong U.S. policy over the years to make sure that South Korea and Japan have no interest in going nuclear. One of the reasons the U.S. is deploying this anti-ballistic missile system, the so-called THAAD, is to make sure the South Koreans and Japanese believe that we are there for them and we will not allow them to be threatened. Similarly, we have many times stated our conviction that we will support them with a so-called nuclear umbrella. So we don't want to get to the point where those countries are considering going nuclear. But with respect to proliferation, I think we already have it. We have a North Korean regime that doesn't care what the United States says, doesn't care what China says, doesn't care what anyone says. They seem to want to develop a nuclear weapons system. And the question is, what are we all going to do about it?
And Ambassador, we've had a bit of a show of force by the United States, flying a bomber over the Korean Peninsula, or planning to fly one. Given the volatile situation in that part of the world right now, is this a smart idea? I mean, could it escalate tensions even further?
Well, I think what is escalating tensions is a North Korean military testing program that has really picked up the pace in recent months. After all, this is the second nuclear test just this year, and now we have word that there may be a third test just this year. So there's much to be concerned about, and I think what the U.S. is trying to do is reassure its allies that we are watching this carefully and we're prepared to take whatever measure. So I consider it an effort to try to calm down friends and allies in the region and reassure them that the U.S. is very much prepared to deal with this if we have to, even militarily.
And speaking of escalating tensions, Eun-jung, the South Korean news agency Yonhap is reporting that South Korea has plans, it says, to annihilate the DPRK capital if the North launches a nuclear strike, if Pyongyang makes plans to launch a nuclear strike. What are the implications of that?
First and foremost, I think I mentioned this several times whenever I come back to this studio. But again, the Republic of Korea is a liberal democracy. There are many different opinions. So it is not a monolithic player like a DPRK is. But this time might be way different from the previous 4 nuclear tests, because now we're totally frustrated with our generosity. Probably the level of the tolerance, South Korean people's tolerance diminishes pretty dramatically this time. So we are expecting more like a concrete countermeasure that can be done by our own government. Of course, we trust the nuclear umbrella provided by the alliance ship, but still many South Korean citizens have been frustrated with our own generosity represented by the Sunshine Policy, and this time we'd love to actually see some countermeasure in theory that can be possible if anything happened. Of course, it is not a hopeful idea, but a hopeful scenario, but still many Korean people would love to see that kind of, policies.
Tong Jia, let's take a step back here and look at the problem that we're facing right now on the Korean Peninsula. Why do you think the DPRK continues to conduct these tests and wants to be a nuclear power?
I think North Korea is genuinely concerned about its national security. We just discussed the U.S. flying bombers over the Korean Peninsula. That is certainly understood by China as an American measure to reassure its regional allies. But for the North Koreans, those bombers were there to practice simulated bombing of North Korean critical military facilities. So that directly exacerbates North Korean threat perception. And whenever there is a joint military exercise to the south of the border, there were reports that in Pyongyang we would see a large number of military vehicles parked along the side of the streets of Pyongyang, covered by camouflage nets, which means the North Koreans were really concerned that South Korea and the United States might use those military exercises as a disguise to launch a sudden strike against North Korea. So I think the objective of the North Korean regime is to develop a reliable nuclear deterrent to defend its national security. It is certainly not interested in launching a sudden nuclear strike out of the blue against South Korea or the United States without being provoked first.
Ambassador Hill, what do you make of that?
The annual exercises are very necessary because the U.S. has an alliance with South Korea. That alliance is the essence of deterrence, and the purpose of an alliance is to be prepared in a time of war. And so in order to be prepared, you have to have common exercises. My only regret about the exercises is I wish we had them in the spring of 1950. Secondly, this idea that North Korea only needs nuclear weapons to protect itself against aggression. The United States, South Korea, none of these countries has an interest in invading North Korea, unless North Korea uses nuclear weapons or somehow attacks the South. So the United States has no interest in starting a war with North Korea, but it is very important to demonstrate military strength, to demonstrate our capacity, to take very, very strong measures against the North Korean regime that thinks it can attack its neighbors.
Unjong, so far the response to what the DPRK has been doing is to impose sanctions on the DPRK. There's now talk of more sanctions. Is there any evidence that sanctions have worked?
As we all know, the UN's Security Council's the latest sanction, 2270, Resolution 2270, has been regarded as the historically toughest ever. But still, many Korean people also at the same time think that there were still rooms, or some people, many people actually are skeptical about whether or not the 2270 was completely implemented. So we assume that there have been some rooms, some niches for North Korea to escape from that kind of sanctions.
Well, the thing is that the people who have been most skeptical about this are the people of the DPRK themselves, the leadership there. They are saying that the threat of new sanctions is, to quote them, laughable.
So are you asking, whether or not more sanctions should be done?
Right.
Or again, Korean people, they do have diverse opinions about that. But still, I have to emphasize this: our skepticism or frustration, the level of frustration has been escalating, which means if there is more rooms, to more fully implement the sanction, or if there is any more room, to strengthen the existing sanction, if so, probably many people will support that idea too.
Tong Zhao, what is your view on sanctions? Have they worked? Will they work in the future?
I think there isn't really much room left for us to impose more sanctions against North Korea. The last UN Security Council resolution already adopted the most comprehensive sanction regime against North Korea, and it hasn't really worked. The only radical step we can take forward in the future is to completely implement a comprehensive economic embargo against North Korea, completely cutting off North Korea from any trade, any economic exchanges with the outside world. However, that option is very dangerous for a few reasons. First of all, that will certainly cause major humanitarian consequences to the general public in North Korea. The major negative impact will be borne by the general public. And secondly, if China chooses to completely cut off North Korea, China will only make itself a direct enemy of North Korea. And if the North Korean regime believing that it is facing a life or death situation, it might very well choose to threaten China directly, even with nuclear weapons. So that is the worst case scenario that China will do everything to avoid. And thirdly, even if we can convince everyone to completely cut off North Korea, there is no guarantee that North Korea facing economic collapse and even regime collapse, will choose to compromise on nuclear programs, it may very well choose to be more provocative, to embrace more brinksmanship, to be more risk-taking. And how do we deal with that? So I don't think sanctions can really bring us the results we want.
Ambassador Hill, Russia has also condemned the nuclear test, but the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says that we need to go back into the six-party talks. There needs to be a more creative way of getting out of this logjam that exists on the Korean Peninsula right now.
Well, I think it's worth recalling what we did in the six-party talks, which was the purpose of the six-party talks was to induce the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons programs. So the North Koreans said to us, well, we don't have a treaty. We put a treaty on the table. They said, we don't have enough energy. We put energy assistance on the table. They said, we don't have enough economic assistance. We put economic assistance. And they said, we don't have cross-recognition of our state, and we put recognition on the table. We're prepared to put a lot of things on the table, provided the goal remained that North Korea gets out of the nuclear weapons business. We put all these things on the table, and then they seemed to want these things until they didn't want these things, and then they walked away. So I'm not ruling out negotiation. I think the door should always be open to negotiation, but I think we have a body of evidence to suggest that negotiations won't work. So I think it's very important for the U.S. and China, other countries, to get together and to decide what we're going to do. And if we have to take harsher measures, whether in nuclear, whether in military side or sanctions, we need to sit down and have that discussion. I don't think it's fair to China when people in the U.S. say China has to solve this. But at the same time, I don't think it's fair to us when the Chinese either say the U.S. has to solve it or it cannot be solved. We need, I think, a more deliberate, a more serious effort to try to resolve this terrible issue, which is really threatening the peace and security of the region.
I think the Chinese thinking is economic sanctions really do not address the root cause of North Korea's nuclear ambition. And in the long term, the only way to really peacefully resolve the overall North Korean problem is still to encourage North Korea to gradually liberalize its economy, to open up, and to become a member of the international community. In that sense, I think we still need to keep the economic ties with North Korea, to keep the channel of communication open. And also in terms of diplomacy, I think at this point, it is already very clear to everyone that a near-term denuclearization of North Korea is impossible. So we have to set a more pragmatic, a more practical goal, which is, I think, to freeze North Korea's nuclear and missile program as soon as possible. And in fact, North Korea has signaled its willingness to engaging in such discussions to freeze or limit its nuclear and missile programs. In exchange, the United States and South Korea should scale down or even suspend their joint military exercises. I think that is a much practical goal for diplomacy, and we should all work together to achieve that as soon as possible.
Okay, lots more to talk about, but we're going to have to take a short break right now. More on the fallout from the DPRK's latest nuclear test when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. We're talking about world reaction to the nuclear test conducted by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea last Friday. Let's get back to our panel. And John, let me start with you this time. Ambassador Hill spoke a moment ago about the deployment of the THAAD missile defense system in the Republic of Korea, or South Korea. That's a system that's developed by the United States, will be deployed by the United States. There was an opinion piece published in China Daily newspaper over the weekend said that the nuclear test conducted by the DPRK should not come as a big surprise given the US plan to deploy THAAD in South Korea. To what extent is that driving the DPRK's actions?
THAAD is not, I don't think a THAAD is the determining factor.
Yeah.
I mean, to change whatever those North Korea's intention or behavior, especially since Kim Jong-un came to the office, their intention became crystal clear. Probably during his father's period, they sometimes tried to play with this card as a kind of bargaining chip for the better negotiations, but still, this time, or ever since the Kim Jong-un came to the office, his intention or Pyongyang's intention is crystal clear. So I don't think, again, the decision on the THAAD deployment was the determining factor to influence their intention. Rather than that, now more and more, as I mentioned during the previous session, again, more and more South Korean people need a more concrete countermeasurement for any contingency. So that is why more and more South Korean people also think THAAD, even though THAAD is not a panacea, or it is not almighty panacea at all. It is only one method, but still we want to build a kind of multi-layered missile defense system to, again, to countermeasure any contingency.
Ambassador Hill, could THAAD become a bargaining chip in these negotiations? Because concern over the deployment of THAAD has also been expressed by China, which says that it's a threat to peace and stability in the region. Would THAAD factor into any negotiations at all?
Well, at this point, we have a North Korea that seems to be very resolute in carrying out a military program and carrying out military tests. They have ignored, even spoken with contempt of all UN Security Council resolutions that were supported by the United States, China, Russia, everybody. So we have a regime that simply doesn't care what anyone says. They don't care about sanctions. They've scoffed at these sanctions. So I think we're at the point where the United States, if this alliance with South Korea is to be meaningful, we absolutely have to help South Korea defend itself, and that's what THAAD is about. If the North Koreans were to enter back to negotiations, again, show concrete steps to denuclearization, I'm sure there wouldn't be a need for THAAD. But at this point, we see no sign that North Korea is interested.
Tong Jia, the Chinese intention is to denuclearize the peninsula. They don't want to see any nuclear weapons on the peninsula at all. If the deployment of THAAD goes through, if it goes ahead, what impact will it have on those efforts to denuclearize the peninsula?
First of all, I think there is a direct connection between North Korea's fifth nuclear test and the deployment of THAAD in South Korea. The North Koreans knew that given the troubled relations between China and South Korea and China and the United States, China would be left with very few good options to respond to North Korean provocations. So THAAD does play a major role here. But regarding North Korea, we have to understand the primary objective of North Korea to develop nuclear weapons is to achieve a nuclear deterrent against South Korea and the United States. It does not have any other more ambitious objectives. And therefore, if the missile defense systems undermine North Korea's nuclear deterrent, it will only encourage North Korea to double down on its missile and nuclear developments. And also, from the offense-defense balance of military technologies, at this point, it's much easier and cheaper for North Korea to build better and build more nuclear missiles than for the South Koreans and United States to deploy a workable missile defense system. The North Koreans can simply build up their stockpile to overwhelm the missile defense system. And therefore, a missile defense system doesn't really provide real security for South Korea or the United States. In the long term, missile defense undermines, Chinese and Russian interests. This is due to the very sad geographical proximity between North Korea and China, and therefore any missile defense system that can defend against the North Korean missiles will somewhat also affect Chinese systems. And therefore, if China believes that its core national security interests are undermined by South Korea and the United States, China will be in a worse place to really cooperate with South Korea and the United States to deal with North Korean provocations.
All right, Ambassador Hill, where does it all go to from here? Are the six-party talks still the best way to move forward?
You know, I don't think it really matters whether they're four-party, six-party, or 66-party. I think the issue is whether North Korea is really interested in denuclearizing. Now, we've heard that, you know, it's pretty clear that what the North Koreans would like to see is they would freeze their testing in return for essentially what would amount to an abrogation of the U.S.-South Korean alliance. Well, the U.S. and South Korea is not going to do that. Of course, the North Koreans should be welcome to come back through the door, but I think it's important to understand that they walked out. They have completely ignored UN Security Council resolutions. They've created a situation where North Korea has the right to do whatever it wants to do, regardless of what everyone else thinks they should do. And I really think the North Koreans, are creating these terrible tensions, and these tensions will result in things that the Chinese don't like, such as THAAD, but this is an inevitable result of nuclear testing. And so the North Koreans need to understand that they have started this dance, and that we don't have the option of backing away and creating problems with our allies in Northeast Asia.
Tong Jia, what do you think? Where is this all going to get us to?
Well, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi proposed a dual-track approach to deal with North Korea's nuclear program, which is to simultaneously pursue denuclearization with replacing the armistice with a peace treaty on the peninsula. I think you know, that's a very general proposal, but to be more specific, a near-term goal really should be set to try to freeze North Korean nuclear and missile program as soon as possible. You know, the North Koreans demand that in order for it to stop nuclear tests, South Korea and the United States should suspend joint military exercises. I think that's a cost that should be acceptable to them. There is no way that we can reach any deal without taking any compromises. And I think that's a reasonable compromise because it does not really require a very complicated verification regime. And it is not very costly to implement that type of agreement because if you believe that the other side is cheating, you can easily resume your previous activity. So I think that's something that everyone should seriously explore.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And we'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page. You'll find that at CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.